Well, on the surface, your two talks seem very different, from Rwanda to comp plans in the United States. But on the other hand, there were all these common threads, public health being one, affordability, and those are other issues. So I'd love to hear what the two of you are thinking, having just heard your two talks along these lines. Any thoughts? And how, for example, can we, given the conversation earlier of Joe's presentation, in terms of what is the infrastructure we can actually afford? I mean, to me, one of the things about your work in Rwanda is you just looked at the constraints they had and how to innovate new kinds of infrastructure, which also had a health component to it. And then how can we weave those things into comp planning so that we're actually putting in place the infrastructure we can afford in the U.S.? Thoughts about that?
I'll kick it off in that expectations are much different. Mm-hmm. And so expectations are going from misery to better in a lot of cases where we're not suited for that in the United States. It's got to be perfection. We treat wastewater to near potable water standards. Taking lessons from here and bringing them to other parts of the world doesn't necessarily translate, like I said. Mm-hmm. Similarly, taking lessons from Rwanda, India, and that type of thing doesn't translate here. For example, I said gravity is free energy, and it is. And there's gravity everywhere in the world, but what I mean specifically is topographic relief. So most of our cities don't have, 26 watersheds to play around with. Right. So it really is looking at lessons learned in just this constraints view on a bigger scale, but also expectations. So engineers are very compartmentalized here in the United States, where you do wastewater, you do energy, you do transportation, and you're not under this common yoke of a constraint. Mm-hmm. And also in your master plan, you have one centralized treatment plant. Right. So you can't use gravity. You have to. Of course, this is how we do it. So it begins with this whole discussion with planners and architects and city council to really reevaluate how things are moving, what's our life cycle impact on the environment, and also life cycle costs.
Yeah, it's interesting, non sequitur may have been the obvious reaction to putting ours together, because I was dealing with the U.S. and you're dealing with Mark was talking about very different issues, right. But there's common lessons and themes and concepts that kind of underpin, and I think there's a lot we can learn from some of those localized solutions. The community-based solutions based on conditions in foreign countries, and that's actually part of the power of the comp plan standards. And I mentioned how different communities they're adapting these and using it in their own way. They're not meant to be prescriptive, and so finding out sort of community-based solutions and around ideas like, say, distributed energy, distributed systems. The centralized systems aren't working, but the distributed things like green infrastructure are the way to go, and that's already being done sort of overseas, but there's also great opportunity to scale up technologies that we have in our country to bypass that whole centralized paradigm that wouldn't work overseas anyway.
Right. But I also want to add that, so with the University of Minnesota, I'm also looking at just sustainable infrastructure in China, India, and the US, and they take on different flavors. Right. So in China, what is it when you can do all that? When you can construct a brand new city, planners on using Geodesign, do everything. They planned it all out. But they're still not looking at these constraints in a different way. And it's a brand new city. People move in and follow the form, so to speak. In India, what I'm looking at is how do developing countries go from developing world infrastructure, which is that paradigm I was talking about, and as you're starting to become more economically vibrant, how do you switch to a developed world infrastructure? Right. But in the U.S., I'm looking at, as Joe mentioned, the decay. Right. And what I'd also like to bring up is what are the decay rates of cities in the U.S.? And I think if we started that discussion, and as I pointed out, in one city I worked in, they said we put in infrastructure at a 100-year lifespan, and we funded at a 500-year replacement rate. So that's a decay. So right away, the city has an 80% decay rate. And if you ask people, what kind of decay rate are you willing to accept? I think that conversation would have some traction here.
Yeah, interesting. David, so you put out a call to deputize all of us to be public health advocates, and how would that actually occur? For example, are you suggesting that every time we study something, we bring in public health layers to the analysis, so we look at everything in terms of public health?
I think there's just, seize the opportunity.
Yeah.
You don't need to, that would be, I think, one way of doing it. Think about public health as another lens. I think that's the consciousness of these issues are doing it. Everyone's talking about it now. Architects are talking about it. Our professions are talking about it. But systematically, what would that mean if that were integrated into a planning and design process? So you do it without thinking. There's this thing out there called health impact assessments, which people might have heard of. It's kind of came out of the public health profession, but it's kind of a reaction. It's meant to look at policies and projects and programs that are proposed. What would be the impacts on health? And so it's reactive in a way, but this is about flipping the paradigm. Well, our goal is what's more fundamental than being healthy as people, as a society, as an environment?